Again, as Grant Meadows gripped the edge of his desk, he stared at the envelope in front of him. It bore no return address, just his name scrawled in black ink, firm, deliberate strokes that exuded purpose. The contents of the envelope had tipped his world on its axis. A grainy photograph slipped from his trembling hand onto the mahogany surface. It captured his wife, Cassandra, with a man he didn't recognize, the two entwined in an embrace at a park he knew all too well. Middlewoods Park. It was the same park where they had celebrated their 20th anniversary, surrounded by family and friends. The memory now felt like a cruel mockery. For 30 years, Cassandra had been his partner, his confidant, the axis of his life. And now this. Grant's pulse thundered in his ears as he replayed the anonymous tipster's words. You deserve to know the truth. These photos are just the beginning. Look closer, and you'll find the lies buried in plain sight. And so he had. He spent sleepless nights combing through bank statements, tracking her odd behavior. The clandestine phone calls, late nights at work, and dismissive attitude. They weren't just figments of his imagination. They were the threads of betrayal, woven together in a tapestry of deceit. Grant glanced at the clock. 3:15 p.m. Cassandra wouldn't be home until 5 o'clock, or so she claimed. He closed his laptop, steeling himself. Today, he'd confront her. Not with anger or desperation. Those emotions had burned through him already. No, today would be different. He'd let her expose herself, and when she did, he'd be ready. At 3:45 p.m., Grant heard the faint hum of Cassandra's car pulling into the driveway. He didn't rush to greet her. Instead, he remained seated at the kitchen table, his bourbon untouched. The weight of the confrontation to come settled heavily on his chest. The front door opened with a creak, and her voice floated in, tinged with surprise. Grant? What are you doing here? He didn't look up immediately, letting her words hang in the air. When he finally met her gaze, the sight confirmed what the photos had suggested. Standing just behind her was a man, a younger man, with sharp features and nervous eyes. His polished shoes and tailored suit screamed lawyer, but the way he lingered behind Cassandra betrayed his unease. Cassandra, Grant said evenly, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. What's this? His eyes darted toward the man. She hesitated, her polished demeanor faltering for the first time. This is Ethan Callahan, she said, her tone clipped. He's a colleague. Ethan stepped forward, extending his hand. Mr. Meadows, it's a pleasure to meet you. Grant ignored the gesture, locking eyes with Cassandra instead. Funny, he said, his voice sharp. You've always insisted on keeping work and home separate. What's changed? The color drained from her face as she stammered. Grant, you're overreacting. Ethan and I are just working on a project. Why does he call you Cassandra? Grant cut her off, his voice rising. In our home? You've always hated when people used your first name so casually. What else has changed? Ethan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Cassandra for guidance, but she offered none. Her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, and Grant wasn't about to let her rebuild it. Grant rose from his chair and gestured toward the living room. Why don't we all sit down? I'll fix us some drinks. We have a lot to talk about. Cassandra nodded hesitantly, her movements stiff as she perched on the edge of the couch. Ethan followed suit, though he looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Grant took his time in the kitchen, deliberately clinking glasses and pouring drinks with precision. He needed them to sweat. When he returned, he handed Cassandra her usual Merlot and placed a glass of cheap beer in front of Ethan. Taking his own seat with a tumbler of bourbon, Grant raised his glass in a mock toast. To honesty, he said, his tone icy. Ethan hesitated, lifting his glass to his lips. The moment he took a sip, he grimaced. This beer tastes odd. Grant smirked. It's Pabst Blue Ribbon. Thought you might appreciate it. Ethan's expression soured, and Cassandra shot Grant a withering glare. You're being ridiculous, Grant. We came here to have a calm discussion. Calm? Grant interrupted, his voice sharp as steel. Calm would have been nice 6 weeks ago, before I learned about your project partner. Cassandra's composure shattered. How did you? I know everything, Grant said, cutting her off. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Every whispered conversation, every stolen kiss. every lie you've told. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of Ethan's glass clinking as he set it down. Cassandra sat frozen, her usually confident demeanor crumbling under Grant's unrelenting gaze. Ethan fidgeted beside her, his polished exterior beginning to crack. Grant leaned back, taking a slow sip of his bourbon, savoring the tension. He wanted them to squirm. "I'm curious," Grant began, his voice cold and deliberate. "How long you thought you could get away with this?" Cassandra's voice wavered as she replied, "Grant, I don't know what you're talking about. This is a misunderstanding." Grant let out a bitter laugh. "A misunderstanding? Let me clarify." Then he reached into the drawer of the side table and pulled out a thick manila folder. Tossing it onto the coffee table, the photographs and printed messages spilled out like a dam breaking. Ethan leaned forward, his face blanching as he recognized the images. Cassandra gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Where did you get these?" she whispered. Grant's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Does it matter? What matters is that I know. The dinner dates, the weekend picnic at Middlewoods Park, the hotel receipts. Oh, and let's not forget the text messages. Very creative, by the way. I particularly liked the one where you called him your escape. That was poetic." Cassandra's composure shattered as tears welled up in her eyes. "Grant, please, let me explain." "I'm all ears," Grant said, leaning forward. "But let me warn you, whatever excuse you come up with better be good. Because right now, all I see is a woman who's thrown away 30 years of marriage for what exactly?" He turned to Ethan, his eyes narrowing. "And you? What's your excuse? Struggling to find friends in Connecticut? Or were you just hoping for a shortcut up the corporate ladder?" Ethan opened his mouth to speak, but Grant raised a hand to silence him. "Don't. Whatever drivel you're about to spew, save it. I'm not interested." Cassandra broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Grant, I don't know what to say. It was a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. I never meant to hurt you." Grant's laugh was sharp and humorless. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting to lock the door. A mistake is burning dinner. Cheating? That's not a mistake, it's a choice. A series of choices, actually, and you made them willingly. I still love you," Cassandra pleaded, her voice desperate. "I never stopped loving you. This was just—" "Don't you dare," Grant snapped, his voice like a whip. "Don't you dare sit there and insult my intelligence by pretending this was some fleeting lapse in judgment. Do you even understand what you've done?" Ethan shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Mr. Meadows, I take full responsibility for my part in this." "Stop talking," Grant interrupted, his voice deadly calm. "You don't get to play the noble idiot here. You knew she was married. You knew exactly what you were doing." Ethan swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. Grant rose from his seat, his movements deliberate. "You think you've both been clever, sneaking around behind my back. But here's the thing about secrets. They don't stay buried. And now, it's time you face the consequences." Cassandra's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Grant didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the television remote and turned on the screen. The Zoom interface flickered to life, and a familiar face appeared, a silver-haired man in a sharp suit. "Nathan Blake, good to see you," Grant said, his tone cordial. "Likewise," Nathan replied. "Shall we begin?" "Go ahead," Grant said, gesturing to Cassandra and Ethan. "They're all ears." Nathan adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Meadows, Mr. Meadows has officially filed for divorce as of this morning. The grounds? Infidelity. The evidence supporting this claim is irrefutable. You'll find the full report in the folder before you. As for the prenuptial agreement, it remains ironclad. You'll leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, and nothing more." Cassandra's face went ashen. "Grant, you can't be serious." "Oh, I'm deadly serious," Grant replied, his tone icy. "You made your choices, Cassandra. Now you get to live with them." Nathan continued, unperturbed by Cassandra's protests. "Additionally, the board of Meadows Insurance has voted unanimously to relieve you of your position as head of HR effective immediately. You are to return all company property, including your car and corporate credit cards. Your severance package has been revoked." Cassandra's breath hitched, her hands trembling. "You can't do this. I built that department, and I built this company," Grant interjected. You were just along for the ride. Before Cassandra could respond, Grant initiated another call. This time, a woman's face filled the screen, blonde, sharp-eyed, and furious. Jessica Callahan, the woman said coldly. Ethan, surprise. Ethan's face paled. Jessica, Save it, she snapped. I've already spoken to the investigator Mr. Meadows hired. I've seen everything. The affair with his wife, the others before her. Yes, Ethan, I know about them all. The divorce papers are already on their way. And as for custody of the girls, don't even think about fighting me. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Jessica cut him off. You've destroyed enough lives, Ethan. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Ethan slumped back into the couch, his face ashen. The weight of Jessica's words, combined with Grant's unyielding gaze, seemed to crush him. Cassandra, meanwhile, sat frozen, her mouth opening and closing as though words might save her. But no words could undo the devastation Grant had unleashed. Grant reached for the remote again, his movements deliberate. There's one last call I need to make, he said, his tone calm, yet dripping with anticipation. Cassandra shot up from the couch, her face pale with panic. No, please, Grant, whatever this is, don't. Ignoring her, Grant pressed a button, and the screen flickered to life once more. This time, a younger woman appeared, her long, auburn hair tied back, her sharp features unmistakably similar to Grant's. Megan, their only daughter. Hey, Dad, Megan said warmly, her smile faltering as she noticed the tension in the room. What's going on? Cassandra staggered backward, her hands trembling. Megan, sweetheart, don't. Megan snapped, her tone suddenly icy. Don't you dare call me that. Grant leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Megan, your mother has some things she needs to explain. Megan folded her arms, her expression hard. Oh, I already know. I heard everything. And I mean everything. Cassandra's face crumpled. Megan, please. Save it, Mom. Megan interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. Do you have any idea what you've done? What you've put Dad through? What you've put this family through? You're a liar. A selfish, disgusting liar. Cassandra sank onto the couch, sobbing openly. Megan, it's not that simple. You don't understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Megan shot back. I understand that you've destroyed this family. I understand that you've betrayed the one person who's always been there for you. And I understand that you're a coward, hiding behind excuses and blaming everyone but yourself. Grant allowed the exchange to continue, the room heavy with Cassandra's sobs and Megan's furious accusations. But he wasn't finished yet. As Cassandra crumbled further under the weight of her daughter's words, Grant addressed Ethan. As for you, he began, his voice low and deadly, you're not just a cheater. You're a fraud. You lied to her, to your wife, to everyone around you. And now, you're going to pay. Ethan flinched. Grant, look, I know you're angry, but you have no idea. Grant cut him off. He pulled out a second folder, sliding it across the table. This is a comprehensive dossier on your life. Your finances, your shady dealings, your questionable business trips. It's all there. By Monday, every detail will be in the hands of your firm's board, the local bar association, and, a few news outlets who would love a story like this. Ethan's face turned crimson. You can't do that. Oh, I can, Grant replied smoothly. And I will. As the clock ticked closer to 6 p.m., Grant rose from his chair, his movements steady and deliberate. I'm heading out for dinner, he announced, turning to Cassandra. When I come back, I expect you and all your things to be gone. Don't take anything that doesn't belong to you. And don't think about coming back. This house is mine. Cassandra looked up at him, her tear-streaked face desperate. Grant, please, don't do this. But he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Ethan. And you, 3 days. That's how long you have to get out of this state. If you're still here by Monday, I'll make sure you regret it in ways you can't imagine. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Grant silenced him with a glare. Don't test me. As Grant walked toward the door, he paused, casting one last look at the shattered pair. Enjoy your weekend in New York, he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I hear the weather's supposed to be lovely. With that, he stepped outside, the weight of the confrontation lifting slightly from his shoulders. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. But for now, he had made his point. The path forward was clear, and he would walk it alone, stronger, wiser, and free of the chains Cassandra had bound him with. The brisk evening air hit Grant as he stepped out onto the driveway, his hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. He slid into his car, the leather seat creaking beneath his weight, and exhaled deeply. Tonight wasn't about mourning the past. It was about embracing the future. As he drove away, the house grew smaller in his rearview mirror, a symbol of the life he was leaving behind. He had already made dinner reservations at a quiet steakhouse downtown. It was a place he'd frequented in his younger days, long before Cassandra had swept into his life and changed everything. Back at the house, chaos reigned. Cassandra sat on the couch, her hands clutching the divorce papers as if sheer willpower could make them disappear. Ethan stood near the window, his phone pressed to his ear. But the call was brief, ending with a frustrated growl. "What am I supposed to do now?" Cassandra whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His face was flushed, his usually composed demeanor unraveling. "I don't know, Cassandra. I have my own problems now, thanks to this disaster. My career is hanging by a thread." Cassandra snapped her head toward him, her eyes narrowing. "Your career? You're worried about your career? My entire life is falling apart because of you." Ethan threw up his hands. "Because of me? Don't pin this all on me, Cassandra. You made your choices, too. Get out," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. Ethan froze. "What?" "I said, get out," she shouted, her voice cracking with rage. "You've done enough damage. Just leave." For a moment, Ethan stood there, stunned. Then, without another word, he grabbed his coat and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Grant's dinner was as satisfying as it was symbolic. The juicy ribeye paired with a glass of whiskey felt like the first real indulgence he'd allowed himself in years. He wasn't just savoring the meal, he was savoring his freedom. After dinner, he drove to the riverfront, parking his car and stepping out to admire the city lights reflecting on the water. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The confrontation had been brutal, yes, but it had also been necessary. He had reclaimed control over his life, a life that had been slipping away, piece by piece, for far too long. The next morning, Cassandra awoke to an empty house. Ethan was gone, his belongings hastily packed and scattered. The silence was deafening. She stared at the clock, dread creeping over her as she realized she needed to face the reality of her situation. By 10 a.m., her phone buzzed relentlessly with calls and messages. Her employer, her friends, even her parents. News of the confrontation had spread faster than she anticipated. Grant hadn't been discreet, and the private investigator's findings were starting to circulate among her colleagues. The walls were closing in, and she was powerless to stop it. At noon, a knock at the door made her jump. She hesitated before opening it to find a courier holding an envelope. Inside was a formal notice from her employer. Immediate termination. Her chest tightened as she read the words. Everything was slipping through her fingers. Ethan's situation wasn't much better. His firm had called an emergency meeting that morning to discuss the evidence Grant had sent them. By 3 p.m., his position had been terminated, and his name was plastered on a notice sent to the local bar association for unethical conduct. He was effectively blacklisted. He returned to his apartment only to find Jessica waiting for him, her icy glare cutting through him like a blade. "I came for the last of my things," she said coldly, brushing past him. "Jessica, please," he began, but she raised a hand to silence him. "No more lies, Ethan. You've destroyed enough lives. The girls and I are staying in Michigan, and you're staying out of our lives. Permanently." Her words hit him harder than he anticipated. As she left, he sat on the edge of his bed, his head in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his actions bearing down on him, suffocating him. Meanwhile, Grant focused on rebuilding his life. He threw himself into his business, reviving the passion he once had for the company he'd built from the ground up. His employees noticed the change immediately. He was more engaged, more driven, and, strangely, more at peace. He also reconnected with old friends, people he'd lost touch with over the years. A weekly poker game became a ritual, a chance to unwind and laugh without the burden of his failed marriage weighing him down. Slowly but surely, he began to heal. Months later, Grant found himself at a cafe, sipping his coffee when he spotted Cassandra walking past. She looked tired, older than he remembered, but there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes when she saw him. She hesitated, then approached. "Grant," she said softly, her voice tentative. "Can we talk?" He set his coffee down and regarded her calmly. "What is there left to say?" "I'm sorry," she said, tears welling up in her eyes. "For everything." Grant nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've heard that before. What I haven't heard is what you've done to make things right." Her silence was answer enough. "I hope you find peace, Cassandra," he said, rising to leave. "But my life doesn't include you anymore." As he walked away, he felt a strange sense of relief. The chapter was closed, and for the first time in years, the future felt like his own.